My latest book is a collection of stories called Difficult Pleasures. It was published last year in 2012. And Difficult Pleasures is united. The stories are connected by the fact that they're all about fairly solitary urban individuals on some kind of quest. And when I say quest, I don't mean a grand journey. I don't mean an odyssey. I mean everyday journeys, everyday quests, whether it's a tangle in a relationship that somebody tries to unravel by simply taking a bus to the next town, whether it's a boy in a village school who plays truant and decides to come to the big city for a day, whether it's a boy who's trying to be a photographer and follows an older photographer who he admires to another city. So there is a lot of physical movement in the stories. There is a lot of cityscape, and there is a lot of inner texture, what I would call inner texture, which is that I am not interested in stock situations of conflict. In the Indian situation, a stock situation of conflict would be, for a young person, parents want you to have an arranged marriage and you don't, or you want to have a particular career, they want you to have a different career. And while I am very interested in modern Indian reality, I'm not interested in modern Indian realities, because when you say realities, it's often a grim word, and it's often about these tensions that are all too recognizable. I'm interested in modern Indian reality, by which I mean everyday textures. How do we look at the world? How do we apprehend our experience of life in an Indian city? What does an Indian street look like? What does a couple, both earning their own incomes, both educated, liberated, in what kind of language do they speak to each other? So I'm interested in, at one level, very ordinary situations, but on another level, situations that have a lot of potential for conflict. And difficult pleasures, I've been told that term is an oxymoron, and it cannot apply to any situation. But that's the challenge, I think, to the reader, that can there be a pleasure that's difficult? And it's not the name of any one story in the book, it's a phrase from one of the stories. So that is a little bit what Difficult Pleasures is about. Very much, very much. They have to do with very real cities. There is Bangalore, quite a lot of Bangalore, where I've lived now for the last 15 years. There is Shillong, especially in one story, and Shillong was where I was born and I grew up, and I lived there till I was in my mid-20s. So it's very much a city in which I have grown and become an adult, and I would say formed my conception of the world. So Shillong is very, very important to my imagination. There is Europe. There is a story in which a man living in Paris hears that his brother has killed himself in a small town in Sweden, and he decides to drive across Europe because he needs to sort out in his mind what was his relationship to this brother. It was not an easy relationship. So yes, there is a lot of the outside, of the urban outside in my stories. And there is Goa in one of the stories, another place that I visit very often, and I'm fascinated by the economy of tourism there and what it does to our idea of pleasure, our idea of escape, our idea of liberation from day-to-day life. So yeah, these are real cities. Many of these cities are cities I've experienced myself, but this is not an autobiographical book of stories. These are characters who I imagine in those cityscapes. And like I said earlier, travel is a very important part. So it may start in one place and end up in another. That happens very often in my stories, that you start in one place and at the end of it, you're in another place. And the relationship between the city and the mind. How do places affect the way you feel? That's a very, very central question in many of my stories, because people's feelings change as they change their locations. And often you go to another place in order to get out of the state of mind in which you are. Yeah, I think we live in a world in India especially, and I think the world in general, where we travel a lot. It is very common now to meet people who may be born in one place and live in another. That's more and more the norm rather than the exception. And I'm fascinated by what this does to our sense of ourselves. You know, our vocabulary of belonging, it's always sort of fixing us to specific places. And there is no vocabulary for somebody, for instance, who may not be from Bombay but has always lived there. Maybe you say Mumbai car or you say Bombayite, but there's a certain awkwardness there. And yet this is our experience, that we were born somewhere else and then we come to the big city, and in a sense we become part of that city. And we ought to have a certain claim on that space. So yes, I have traveled a fair bit, I don't think as much as a lot of my contemporaries. Shillong and Bangalore are the two cities I know very well, and I've traveled in Europe to some extent. I've traveled all over India, but as a tourist. So I'm very interested in what the sort of quintessential experience of travel, not travel as a tourist, but travel as a state of mind. What does it do to you? I think in cities, again, increasingly this is, I think, an urban experience, that we are often surrounded by strangers. You walk on a street, you go on a bus, you go to an airport, you go to a shopping mall, you're surrounded by people you do not know. You know, and it's remarkable how, in some ways, how new this is. Because in community life, in village life or in small town life, you often knew the people around you. We no longer know the people around us. And I'm often very curious about who are these strangers around me? What are their stories? So I often daydream about strangers, and I think a lot of these stories started by my asking myself, what could be the story of this person? And it could be just like a snatch of conversation that I hear, that in this context where everyone is a stranger, it acquires depth, it acquires significance. It may be a very ordinary remark, but to me it's like a fragment of evidence of that person's life, what kind of life that person leads. So in a way, these are stories about strangers. They're people I don't know, they're people I've dreamed up, they're people I've imagined. And I think fiction operates on the idea of sympathy, that you're able to imagine somebody else's life that is not your own life, and that sympathy creates that ethical relationship between the reader and the writer, or between the writer and the character. And that is, for me, the inspiration for the stories. How do you imagine yourself into somebody else's life? Yeah, there have been difficult characters and easy characters, and as the title of the book says, it's been a difficult pleasure writing it as well. And I write about all kinds of characters. I write about old men, young women, adolescents, children, but I'm especially attracted to telling stories from the point of view of children. And when I say that, I don't mean these are children's stories. These are stories in which you're seeing the world through a child's point of view, but it's often an adult world. It's often the world of parents, it's the world of adult concerns. And those stories always give me special pleasure, because I think we often underestimate a child's intelligence. And we often think that children are childish, that they think of things in a version of the way adults think, but a simpler version. And to my mind, children don't think in terms of the way adults think, they just think differently. And that difference is often very, very playful, it's very, very magical, but it can also be very tragic, because the adult doesn't often recognize the capacity of a child to imagine. So there are, I think, about 3 stories that are very focused on children in that collection out of the 13 stories, and I feel very happy about those stories, because I enjoyed writing the stories from the point of view of children. It was a slow and gradual process, because I wrote individual stories first. I didn't start with the idea that I'm going to write a book. And to me, what's very important when talking about the short story is that each story is unique and independent. It can come together in a book, and the characters and the stories can talk to each other, but they're each independent creations. And I wrote the stories, I think, in response to a growing demand on the part of Indian publications, newspapers and magazines for stories. There have been lately more anthologies of short fiction. Magazines have been wanting to carry stories. So I started writing stories because people would say, hey, do you have a story? And I would have a fragment of an idea in my mind, but I wouldn't really have worked on it. But when somebody said, would you like to write a story? Then I would sit down and actually work on it. So I worked piecemeal. I worked on the stories separately. And when I had about 10, I thought, hey, maybe these could go into a collection. So I think the whole process from start to finish would have taken me about 5 years. That's how long it took. It is a novel. My next book is a novel, and it is, I'm a little shy of saying too much about it because it's still a work in progress. But I will say that I'm looking at a particular generation that I don't think it's written about so much in contemporary Indian fiction, and this is the sort of generation that is not the young generation, because I think we are curious about that generation because the world around them has changed so much. You know, I'm talking about people who are between 25 and 35. So there's that young generation, what we might call the MTV generation, and then there's that generation of their parents, who we might call the Nehruvian generation. But what about the generation in between? You know, the generation born in the 60s, early to late 60s. To my mind, they sort of fall in between the idealistic Nehruvian generation and the more libertarian MTV generation. And the novel is in some ways an exploration of that question.